On a warm Tuesday evening in late spring, the kind where the air feels thick with the scent of magnolias and distant rain, a woman stepped out of a modest sedan in front of one of Atlanta's most elegant hotels. She wasn't flanked by assistants or trailed by luggage, just a single leather tote bag slung over her shoulder, its corners softened by years of use, and a calmness in her step that came from knowing exactly who she was, even if no one else did. The hotel gleamed under soft golden lights. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering reflections on marble floors, and the doorman, crisp in his navy uniform, greeted guests with practiced charm. But when she approached, he hesitated, just for a heartbeat, before offering a polite but distant nod. She didn't seem to mind. She'd been met with that look before. Not quite suspicion, not quite dismissal, but something in between. The kind of glance that says, "You don't belong here," without ever saying it out loud. Inside, the lobby buzzed with low conversation and the gentle clink of glasses from the bar. Business travelers tapped away on laptops, couples lingered over cocktails, and bellhops wheeled suitcases with quiet efficiency. She walked toward the front desk, her low heels clicking softly against the polished stone. The clerk, a young man with a name tag that read Trevor, was mid-laugh with a colleague when she arrived. He glanced up, smile fading just slightly as his eyes swept over her linen suit. Her silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun. The absence of flashy jewelry or designer handbags. "Good evening," she said, voice steady and warm. "Hi there," Trevor replied, already glancing past her toward the next potential guest. "Checking in?" "Yes, please." "Reservation under Whitmore." He tapped at his keyboard, eyebrows lifting slightly. After a few seconds, he shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're completely booked tonight. No vacancies." She didn't flinch, didn't sigh or raise her voice, just nodded slowly as if considering the words. "I see," she said. "And what about the couple who just walked in behind me?" Trevor turned. A man and woman in jeans and t-shirts, clearly tourists, had strolled up to the desk looking around with wide-eyed curiosity. Without missing a beat, he smiled brightly. "Welcome to the Marlowe Grand." "Checking in?" "Yes," the man said. "Got a reservation under Peterson." Trevor's fingers flew across the keys. "Ah, yes. Suite 712 Riverview. You're all set." He handed over 2 key cards with a flourish. She watched it all unfold in silence, not with bitterness but with a quiet kind of sadness, the kind that comes from seeing the same pattern replay itself, decade after decade, even in places that claim to have moved beyond it. She could have pulled out her phone right then, could have called the regional director, the head of operations, or even the board, but she didn't, because this wasn't just about a room. It was about something deeper, the unspoken rules of who gets treated like a guest and who gets treated like a mistake. Instead, she stepped aside, letting the couple pass with their keys and cheerful thanks. She found a plush armchair near a potted olive tree and sat down, placing her tote gently on the floor beside her. From this spot, she could see everything. The front desk, the concierge, the way staff moved through the space with practiced ease. She designed much of this herself years ago, down to the curve of the reception counter and the shade of the wall sconces. But tonight, none of that mattered. All that mattered was how she looked to someone who'd never seen her before. A housekeeper passed by, pushing a cart stacked with fresh towels. Their eyes met for a second, and the woman gave a small knowing nod. No words were exchanged, but there was recognition there, a silent understanding between 2 people who'd spent lifetimes being underestimated. The housekeeper offered a faint smile before disappearing down the hallway. Minutes ticked by. Guests came and went. Trevor laughed again with his co-worker, this time louder. She watched him hand out room keys to a group of young men in suits, then to a woman with a designer suitcase that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Each time the same warm tone, the same eager helpfulness. Never once did he look in her direction. She thought back to her first job in hospitality, over 50 years ago, when she'd been told the front desk was not suitable for someone like her. Back then, someone like her meant a black woman with ambition and a sharp mind. She'd started in housekeeping instead, folding linens with precision, learning the rhythm of the building, listening to how guests spoke, how staff responded. She'd stayed late, asked questions, took notes in a small spiral notebook she kept in her apron pocket, and slowly, quietly she climbed. Now, decades later, she owned not just this hotel, but a small chain of them. each one built on the idea that luxury shouldn't be reserved for a certain look, a certain name, or a certain bank account. Yet here she was, turned away from her own creation, not because of policy or capacity, but because of perception. She didn't feel angry. Anger was too loud, too messy. What she felt was clarity. This moment, this small everyday injustice, was exactly why she'd kept her ownership quiet for so long. She needed to see the truth unfiltered, and tonight she'd seen it. Outside, the sky darkened. Streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the lobby floor. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked back toward the front desk. Trevor looked up, surprised. "Change of heart?" he asked, still polite but distant. "No," she said gently. "Just wanted to thank you," he blinked. For reminding me why I do what I do." And with that, she turned and walked out the same way she'd come in, calm, composed, and utterly unseen by the very people who worked in her name. But that would change. Not with a shout, not with a scandal, but with the kind of quiet power that shifts entire systems. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is wait, and watch, and remember. And she remembered everything. She didn't go far after leaving the hotel. Just around the corner, to a quiet cafe with mismatched chairs and the kind of coffee that smelled like home. She ordered a chamomile tea, no sugar, and sat by the window watching the city move in its usual rhythm. Cars honked softly in the distance. A street musician played a slow jazz tune on a saxophone that sounded like it had seen better days but still had soul. She sipped her tea and let her mind wander back, not in regret but in reflection. 50 years earlier, she'd stood outside a very different kind of building, a rundown motel on the edge of town with flickering neon and peeling paint. She'd been 22, fresh out of community college with a notebook full of ideas and a heart full of hope. Back then, the idea of owning a hotel, let alone a luxury one in the heart of Atlanta, felt like a dream wrapped in fog. People told her to be realistic. "This industry doesn't open doors for folks like us," someone had said once, not unkindly, just matter-of-factly. She remembered nodding politely, then going home and writing "folks like us" in bold letters at the top of a new page in her notebook. Underneath, she listed every skill she had, every connection she could make, every hour she was willing to work. She didn't argue with the world. She just got to work. Her first real break came not from a boardroom but from a laundry room. She'd taken a job folding towels at a mid-tier hotel, not because she wanted to, but because it was a foot in the door. While others clocked out at 5, she stayed late, asking the night manager questions about occupancy rates, guest complaints, vendor contracts. She noticed things, like how the front desk staff always gave better rooms to guests who smiled or tipped, or how maintenance requests from certain floors took longer to get answered. She didn't call it bias back then. She just called it the way things are. But she filed it all away. Years passed. She moved from housekeeping to reservations, then to front desk, then to assistant manager. Each step was earned, not given. There were moments she almost quit, like the time a guest demanded to speak to someone who actually knows what they're doing after she explained a billing error, or when a senior executive patted her on the head during a meeting, as if she were a well-behaved child. But she held on. Not for revenge, but because she believed hospitality could be different, that it could be human, fair, and warm, no matter who walked through the door. By the time she was in her 40s, she'd saved enough to buy a small, struggling inn outside Savannah. It had leaky roofs and outdated decor, but it had potential. She poured everything into it, her savings, her weekends, her sleepless nights. She trained her staff not just to check guests in, but to see them. Look them in the eye, she'd say. Ask how their day was. Not because it's policy, but because it's decent. The inn thrived. Word spread. Soon investors came calling. She never took money that came with strings. No, we'll handle the branding, or you leave the hiring to us. She kept control even when it meant growing slower. Because to her, this wasn't just business. It was a promise. To every person who'd ever been made to feel small in a grand space. Over time, that little inn became a group of carefully curated properties, each one reflecting her values: elegance without arrogance, service without servitude, luxury that didn't forget its humanity. The Marlowe Grand was the crown jewel, a historic building she'd restored with care, down to the hand-carved banisters and locally sourced linens. She'd named it after her grandmother, A woman who'd cleaned houses for wealthy families but always carried herself like royalty. Dignity isn't something you're given, her grandmother used to say. It's something you carry. And yet last night, standing in that gleaming lobby, she'd been treated as if she carried nothing at all. She stirred her tea, though it didn't need stirring. It wasn't about pride. She didn't need applause or recognition. But she did need her team to understand what they were really selling. It wasn't just rooms with plush beds and minibars. It was trust. It was the feeling that, for a few nights, you belonged somewhere, even if the world outside told you otherwise. That's why she visited her hotels quietly without announcement. She wanted to see the truth, not the performance. And last night's truth stung. Not because she was denied a room, but because the very spirit of the place had been forgotten, even if just for a moment. Back at the cafe, her phone buzzed. A message from her longtime assistant. Board meeting moved to Thursday. Also, saw the news about the downtown protest.
You okay?
She smiled faintly. She hadn't told anyone what happened, but word traveled fast in tight circles. Still, she typed back simply, "I'm fine, and I'll be at the meeting." She paid for her tea and walked back toward her car. The evening air had cooled and the city lights shimmered like scattered stars. As she drove home, not to a mansion but to a cozy townhouse filled with books, family photos, and a garden she tended herself, she thought about the young clerk at the front desk. He wasn't evil, just trained to see the world through a narrow lens, and that she knew was fixable, because real change didn't come from firing people. It came from teaching them to see, from showing them that the woman in the linen suit might be the one who built the walls they lean against. She parked in her driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet. Tomorrow she'd make a call. Not an angry one, a clear one. She'd gather her leadership team, not to scold but to remind, to reconnect them with the why behind the marble floors and crystal glasses. Because hospitality, at its best, wasn't about perfection. It was about humanity, and humanity, she knew, could always be relearned, if someone was willing to teach it, and she was more than willing. She'd been teaching it her whole life. She didn't head straight home after leaving the hotel. Instead, she walked a few blocks to a small park tucked between tall buildings, where the noise of the city softened into something almost peaceful. She found a bench beneath a live oak, its branches heavy with Spanish moss, and sat down. The evening air carried the faint hum of traffic, the distant laughter of children, and the steady rhythm of her own breath. For the first time in hours, she let herself just be. It wasn't anger that sat with her, it was memory. Not the kind that haunts, but the kind that grounds you. She thought about the first time she'd walked into a hotel lobby as a guest, not staff. She'd been in her 30s then, saving for months to treat herself to one night at a place with white tablecloths and room service. She remembered how her hands trembled slightly as she handed over her ID at check-in, half expecting someone to say, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" But no one did. The clerk smiled, called her ma'am, and handed her a key like it was the most natural thing in the world. That small act of ordinary respect had stayed with her for decades. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic, but it had made her feel seen. Now, all these years later, she owned hotels where thousands of guests experienced that same feeling every week, without ever knowing who made it possible. She'd never wanted her name on the marquee. Fame wasn't the point. The point was creating spaces where people, no matter their skin, their accent, or the cut of their clothes, could walk in and feel like they belonged. That was the dream she'd carried since she was a girl, watching her mother clean other people's homes with quiet dignity, always careful not to leave a single fingerprint behind. Her journey hadn't followed a straight line. There were detours, years spent working double shifts, nights sleeping in her car when a deal fell through, moments of doubt so heavy they nearly crushed her. But she kept going. Not because she believed she'd one day stand at the top, but because she believed the system could be kinder. And if no one else was going to build that kinder system, then she would. She remembered the first property she ever bought, a tired little motel with flickering hallway lights and a front desk that smelled like old coffee. The previous owner had laughed when she made an offer. "You sure you know what you're getting into?" he'd asked, not unkindly, but with that familiar tone of polite disbelief. She'd just smiled and handed over the paperwork. Within a year, she'd turned it into a place travelers raved about, not for its luxury, but for its warmth. Guests left notes saying things like, "Felt like visiting family," or The staff remembered my name. That was the real currency to her. As her portfolio grew, so did her influence. She hired people others overlooked, single parents, returning citizens, elders with decades of wisdom but no modern credentials. She paid fair wages, offered training, and treated every role as essential. The person who changes the sheets, she'd tell new managers, holds just as much of our reputation in their hands as the one who signs the checks. The Marlowe Grand was different, though. It was her most ambitious project, a historic building that had once been a symbol of exclusion, where black guests weren't allowed past the lobby in the 1950s. Buying it felt like closing a circle. She'd poured her heart into restoring it, not to erase its past, but to transform it. Every design choice carried meaning. Artwork by local black artists in the hallways, menus featuring recipes passed down through generations, staff trained not just in service, but in empathy. And yet last night, standing in that very lobby, she'd been treated like an intruder. She sighed, watching a squirrel dart across the grass. It wasn't about her ego. She didn't need flattery or special treatment. But she did need her values to live in the walls of her own creation. When the front desk clerk looked at her and saw only what she wasn't, wealthy-looking, flashy, the usual guest, he missed everything she was. And worse, he missed the chance to live up to the standard she'd built the hotel on. She pulled out her phone not to call anyone, but to scroll through photos. There was one of her standing with her first team at that little motel, all of them grinning in matching polo shirts. Another from the opening night of the Marlowe Grand, her hand resting on the restored brass door handle, eyes bright with quiet pride. She'd never posted those photos online, never given interviews unless absolutely necessary. She preferred to let the work speak, but maybe it was time for the work to speak louder. She thought about the young man at the front desk. He probably didn't even realize what he'd done. To him, it was just another busy night. Another guest turned away due to no availability, a line he'd likely used before without a second thought. But assumptions like that repeated enough times become culture, and culture, once said, is hard to change, unless someone with the power to change it decides to act. She stood, brushing a few leaves off her jacket. The sun had dipped below the skyline, and the first stars were beginning to show. She walked back to her car with a new kind of calm, not the calm of resignation, but of purpose. She wouldn't storm in tomorrow demanding apologies. She wouldn't fire anyone on the spot. That wasn't her way. Real change didn't happen through shame. It happened through understanding. Tomorrow, she'd call a meeting. Not a disciplinary one, but a reawakening. She'd gather the leadership team, the general manager, the head of training, the department leads, and she'd ask them simple questions. What does hospitality mean to you? Who do we serve? And how do we make sure no one ever walks out of this hotel feeling invisible? She'd share her story, not as a CEO, but as a woman who'd spent a lifetime being told she didn't belong, and who built a place where everyone could. Because ownership wasn't just about holding shares, it was about holding space, for truth, for growth, for the quiet moments that shape who we are. And she was ready to hold that space again. She didn't fire anyone. That surprised a lot of people, especially the staff who'd heard whispers about what happened in the lobby. They expected shouting, resignations, maybe even a public statement. But instead, the next Monday morning, an email went out to every employee at the Marlowe Grand. Mandatory team session this week. Light lunch provided. Come with an open mind, no threats, no blame. Just an invitation. The sessions took place in the hotel's old ballroom, the one she'd insisted on keeping, even though consultants said it wasn't profitable enough. Now, the chandeliers were dimmed to a soft glow. Round tables were set with water pitchers and simple sandwiches, and chairs were arranged in a loose circle, not rows. She wanted everyone to see each other, not just the front of the room. She walked in quietly on the first day, wearing the same kind of linen suit she'd worn the night she was turned away. But this time there was no mistaking who she was. The room fell silent. Some stood up. Others just stared wide-eyed. She smiled gently and motioned for everyone to sit. "I'm not here to punish," she began, her voice calm but clear. "I'm here because I care too much about this place and about all of you, to let a moment like last week go unexamined." Then she did something unexpected. She told her story, not as a CEO but as a person. She talked about folding towels in a basement laundry room at 19. about being told she didn't have the look for front desk, about saving every spare dollar for years just to buy a failing motel no one else wanted. She spoke about her grandmother, who cleaned houses for wealthy families but always ironed her own dresses so crisp they could stand on their own. She taught me that how you carry yourself matters, she said, but how you treat others matters more. After she spoke, she didn't take questions. Instead, she introduced two guests: a retired school teacher who'd worked in the hotel industry for 40 years and had faced similar slights, and a young diversity trainer who'd grown up blocks from the hotel and now helped businesses build inclusive cultures. Together, they led the staff through real scenarios, not scripted role plays but honest conversations. What would you do if a guest assumed a black colleague was housekeeping, not management? How do you respond when someone says, "You're so articulate," like it's a compliment? What does professional appearance really mean, and who gets to decide? At first, people were quiet, nervous, but slowly hands went up. A bellhop shared how he'd been asked 3 times in 1 week if he was allowed to use the staff elevator. A reservations agent admitted she'd once downplayed her accent on calls because she thought guests wouldn't trust her. The front desk clerk, the one who'd turned her away, sat in the back, arms crossed, face tight. But by the 3rd session, he raised his hand. "I didn't think I was being unfair," he said, voice low. I guess I thought I was following the rules. We get scammed sometimes, people pretending to have reservations. So I default to caution, but I see now. I only apply that caution to certain people. No one interrupted him. No one mocked him. She just nodded and said, "Thank you for saying that out loud." That's the first step. Over the next 2 weeks, every department went through the sessions: housekeeping, maintenance, concierge, even the kitchen staff. She made sure interpreters were available for employees who spoke other languages. She sat in on every single one, not as a boss, but as a listener. Sometimes she took notes. Sometimes she just watched. The way a veteran housekeeper leaned forward when someone shared a story about being ignored, or how a young dishwasher wiped his eyes during a discussion about dignity. Then came the real work: rewriting the hotel's guest experience guidelines. Not from the top down, but with input from the people who lived it every day. The team scrapped phrases like "well-groomed appearance" and replaced them with "respectful and presentable," as defined by our diverse team. They added a new policy: if a guest is turned away, the reason must be documented and reviewed weekly by leadership. They also created a guest dignity checklist, simple reminders like assume capability, listen fully, never guess someone's role or status. But the biggest change was human, not procedural. The front desk clerk, after sitting through all the sessions and speaking with several longtime staff members, asked to meet with her privately. He didn't make excuses. He just said, "I want to do better. And I don't just want to stay at the front desk. I want to help train others so they don't make the same mistake I did." She looked at him for a long moment, saw not arrogance but humility, not defensiveness but desire. "Then let's make that happen," she said. Within a month, he was co-leading orientation for new hires, sharing his story as a caution and a lesson. Guests began noticing the shift, not in grand gestures but in small ones. A warmer greeting. A longer pause before assumptions were made. A genuine "how can I help?" instead of a quick glance to assess worth. One afternoon, an elderly woman came in, dressed simply, asking about room rates. The clerk, now more attentive, more aware, didn't hesitate. He showed her available options, offered a glass of water, and walked her to the elevator when she booked a stay. Later, the woman wrote a note to management. "Felt like I mattered. Thank you." That note ended up on her desk. She read it twice, then tucked it into the same leather tote she'd carried the night everything changed. This wasn't about one person's redemption. It was about a whole culture waking up. And she knew it wouldn't be perfect. Mistakes would still happen. Biases ran deep, shaped by years of messages from the world outside these walls. But now there was a framework for repair, a language for accountability, and most importantly, a shared belief that everyone who walked through the door, guest or staff, deserved to be met with respect, not suspicion. As she walked through the lobby one evening, weeks later, she saw the clerk helping a family with 3 tired kids and too much luggage. He didn't rush them, didn't sigh, just smiled, called for a bellhop, and made sure they got an early check-in. She didn't say anything, just kept walking, a quiet pride warming her chest. Change didn't roar. It whispered. And if you listened closely enough, you could hear it in every good morning, every held door, every moment someone chose to see a person, not a stereotype. And that, to her, was the real luxury. 6 months after that quiet Tuesday night in the lobby, something unexpected began to happen at the Marlowe Grand. Guests started asking for something new, not a better view, not a late checkout, but something they'd heard about from friends or read in a travel blog. Can we get a room under the Whitmore Standard? At first, the front desk team wasn't sure how to respond. There was no official package by that name, no brochure or price tag. But soon they understood. People weren't asking for extra pillows or champagne on arrival. They were asking for the feeling, the sense that they'd be treated with genuine respect no matter what they wore, how they spoke, or what they looked like. Word had spread not through ads but through stories. A teacher from Birmingham said she'd never felt so welcome in a luxury hotel. A retired veteran mentioned how the staff remembered his service dog's name. A young couple on their first big trip together wrote online, "We didn't just stay at a hotel. We felt seen." The phrase Whitmore Standard wasn't coined by marketing. It came from a guest, a woman who'd stayed the week after the reorientation sessions began. She'd noticed the difference right away. The way the concierge asked about her day without glancing at her shoes, how the housekeeper knocked gently and waited for a reply before entering. When she checked out, she told the manager, "This place operates by the Whitmore Standard, doesn't it?" He didn't know what she meant, until she explained. The standard where dignity comes first. The name stuck. Behind the scenes, the hotel group quietly formalized it. Not as a gimmick, but as a living set of principles, updated monthly with input from staff and guests alike. It covered everything from how reservations were handled to how complaints were addressed. But its heart remained simple. Assume nothing. Honor everyone. She watched all of this unfold from the edges as she always had. She still visited her properties unannounced, still sat in lobbies and cafes, still listened more than she spoke. But now when she walked into the Marlowe Grand, the staff didn't just see an elderly black woman in a linen suit. They saw the quiet force behind their purpose, and they greeted her not with awe but with warmth, like family returning home. Then came the interview. She rarely spoke to the press. But when a respected lifestyle magazine asked if she'd share her story, not as a business success but as a lesson in human dignity, she agreed. They met in the hotel's garden courtyard, where jasmine vines climbed the brick walls and birds flitted between magnolia branches. She wore a soft gray dress and no jewelry except her grandmother's watch. The reporter asked the expected questions. How did it feel to be turned away from your own hotel? Did you want to fire the staff? What's your secret to success? She answered them all, but gently steered the conversation elsewhere. Success isn't about buildings or bank accounts, she said. It's about whether you leave people better than you found them. That night in the lobby, it hurt, but it also reminded me why I started this work in the first place. Hospitality isn't just about clean sheets and room service. It's about making space for people to breathe, to belong, to be themselves without fear of judgment. When asked what she hoped her legacy would be, she paused. A breeze rustled the leaves above them. I don't need a legacy carved in stone, she said. I just hope that long after I'm gone, someone walks into a hotel, any hotel, and feels like they matter. Not because they're rich or famous, but because they're human. The article ran 2 weeks later. It didn't go viral in the usual way. No flashy headlines or clickbait. But it was shared quietly, deeply. Teachers posted it in staff rooms. Hospitality schools added it to their reading lists. Other hotel owners reached out not to copy her model, but to ask how they could begin their own reorientation. Within a year, 3 other independent hotels adopted versions of the Whitmore Standard. None used her name without permission. She insisted on that. This isn't about branding, she told them. It's about behavior. Back at the Marlowe Grand, applications for front desk roles tripled. Not because of the pay, though wages had increased, but because people wanted to be part of something that meant something. During interviews, candidates often said, I want to learn how to really see people. The front desk clerk who'd once turned her away now helped lead those interviews. He'd grown into his role with humility and care, and guests often asked for him by name. One rainy afternoon, she sat in the lobby again, this time not as a test, but as a guest. She'd booked a room under her own name just to see how it felt. The clerk who checked her in was new, maybe 20 years old, with bright eyes and a nervous smile. He didn't recognize her, but he looked her in the eye, asked how her day was going, and offered a warm towel for her damp coat. She thanked him, took the key, and headed to the elevator. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the polished metal. Silver hair, calm eyes, the same tote bag slung over her shoulder. She smiled. This was the victory. Not headlines, not apologies, but this. A young person trained in kindness, treating a stranger like a person. No more, no less. Later that evening, she stood on her balcony, looking out over the city lights. Atlanta hummed below, full of stories, struggles, and small acts of grace. She thought about all the doors that had been closed to her over the years, and all the ones she'd opened for others. She hadn't set out to change an industry. She'd only wanted to build one place where people could feel at ease, and somehow that one place had sparked something bigger. She didn't know what came next. Maybe she'd write a book. Maybe she'd mentor more young leaders. Or maybe she'd just keep showing up, quietly watching, listening, ready to step in when needed, but always trusting others to rise. Because real change wasn't loud. It was the clerk who pauses before making an assumption. It's the housekeeper who's asked her opinion on new linens. It's the guest who writes a note saying, "Thank you for seeing me." And in that moment, standing under a sky full of stars, she knew she'd already won. Not because she owned a hotel, but because she'd helped make it human again.